The hospital waiting room was too bright, the kind of light that made every flaw in the world impossible to hide. Machines hummed in the background, monitors blinked in quiet rhythm, and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant. Claire Reynolds sat alone on a cold plastic chair, one hand resting over the curve of her belly. 7 months pregnant, she had learned how to wait in silence. Her husband was late again. That wasn't new. What was new was the weight in her chest, the quiet sense that something wasn't right. The kind of feeling mothers can't explain, but never ignore. The automatic doors slid open with a hiss. The sound of heels echoed down the hallway. Heads turned. Claire looked up and froze. Vanessa Cole walked in as if she owned the floor. Her perfume arrived before she did, heavy and sharp. The woman wore confidence like armor, a tailored white blazer, flawless makeup, diamond studs catching the light. Everyone knew her name, though no one said it aloud. Claire had seen her before in photographs she tried to forget, those glossy tabloid shots of her husband Ethan Cross dining with this same woman at the Ritz, smiling like nothing in the world could touch them. Now that smile was standing in front of her. "Still pretending you're the wife?" Vanessa asked softly. Her voice was sweet but poisoned at the edges. Claire's stomach turned. She wanted to leave, to walk out before this became a scene. "This isn't the place," she whispered. "Please, just go." "Oh, it's the perfect place," Vanessa said, tilting her head. "A hospital full of pity. What better stage for the poor abandoned wife?" Her words hit like slaps. People in the waiting room began pretending not to stare. Claire stood slowly, trying to keep her voice steady. "You need to leave before someone..." But Vanessa took a step closer. The air between them thickened. Her designer bag brushed against Claire's knee, deliberate and slow. "You think he married you for love? You were the trophy wife, temporary. I'm the real thing." Something inside Claire snapped. She didn't answer, just turned slightly away, clutching her belly. Then it happened. A sharp shove, a gasp. The world tilted. The metal chair screeched against the floor as Claire fell hard onto the tiles. Pain burst across her abdomen like fire. A nurse screamed. Another ran for help. Someone yelled for security. The ceiling lights blurred. The sound of the room warped into chaos, running feet alarms, the faint scent of blood mixing with disinfectant. Claire tried to breathe, but the air wouldn't come. Her fingers clawed at the ground. "My baby," she whispered. "Please, not my baby." Nurses rushed to her side, one pressing a hand against her shoulder, another checking for a pulse. The fluorescent light above her glared like a spotlight, merciless and cold. Vanessa stepped back, her perfect smile collapsing into panic. "It was an accident," she stammered. But no one listened. A silver bracelet slipped from her wrist and rolled across the floor, stopping under a chair. The initials VC caught the light. Security burst through the doors too late to stop what had already been done. And in that sterile humming room, with the cries of nurses and the echo of heels fading down the hallway, a quiet war began. One that would change everything the city thought it knew about power, truth, and the price of cruelty. The rain fell in steady sheets, tracing pale rivers down the windows of the black Mercedes. Inside, Richard Reynolds sat in silence, his reflection flickering against the glass, like a ghost of a man he didn't quite recognize. The phone in his hand glowed with a message he had already read 10 times, but still couldn't accept. "Your daughter has been admitted. Condition critical." For a man who had built empires, who could move markets with a single word, Richard had never felt so small. Numbers and negotiations were easy. They obeyed logic, contracts, control. But this was chaos, and chaos did not negotiate. His driver said nothing. The city outside blurred lights, smearing into streaks of white and red like a pulse that wouldn't steady. The wipers beat in slow rhythm, the only sound filling the quiet space between disbelief and fear. He remembered when Claire was little how she used to run barefoot through the backyard after every storm, laughing as her tiny footprints filled with water. Now all he could think about was how fragile she had looked the last time they spoke, her eyes swollen from crying, her words sharper than he deserved. She had told him he cared more about reputation than happiness, and he had dismissed it with the arrogance of a man who thought money solved everything. He had been wrong. Terribly wrong. When his assistant, Lucas Grant, leaned forward from the passenger seat, his voice was low and cautious. "Sir, the hospital just confirmed. She's stable for now, but they're still monitoring both her and the baby." Richard didn't respond. His gaze stayed on the rain-streaked glass eyes, unfocused. In his world, problems came with numbers, percentages, losses, recovery rates. But this wasn't a quarterly report. This was blood breath and heartbeat. Finally, his voice broke the silence, rough and quiet. "Who called it in?" "The nurse on duty." "They said it was an altercation," Lucas replied. "A woman attacked her." For a moment, the car seemed to shrink around him. Richard's jaw clenched, the muscles in his temple twitching. A woman. Of course, there was always a woman. The tabloids, the whispers about Ethan, and that PR consultant, Vanessa Cole, he had brushed them off as gossip. Claire had begged him not to interfere. Now the consequences of his restraint were bleeding out under hospital lights. "Find out everything," he said finally. His tone was calm, but there was a crack beneath it, like the first fissure in glass before it shatters. "Yes, sir." As the car turned onto Fifth Avenue, thunder rolled faintly above the skyline. The city looked indifferent as ever, its towers glittering oblivious to the storm inside one of its wealthiest men. For once, Richard didn't care about perception. He didn't care about investors or image or the endless dance of power. He only cared about getting to his daughter before the light left her eyes. The Mercedes pulled up to Lenox Hill Hospital. Cameras hadn't arrived yet, but they would. Manhattan fed on stories like this. A billionaire's daughter attacked in public was front-page gold. Richard stepped out before the driver could open his door. The rain hit his suit, instantly soaking through. He didn't flinch. Inside, the sterile smell of antiseptic stung his nose as he strode past nurses who recognized him but didn't dare speak. His shoes echoed down the corridor, each step heavier than the last. At the ICU window, he saw her. Claire. Pale, still a maze of wires and monitors surrounding her. A faint beep kept time with her heartbeat, fragile but present. For a moment, Richard couldn't breathe. He placed his hand against the glass, fingertips trembling. He had faced market crashes, hostile takeovers, even federal investigations, without blinking. Yet here, faced with his daughter's broken body, he felt something no power could numb. Fear. Pure, unfiltered human fear. Behind him, Lucas whispered something about security footage, the police, and ongoing investigation. But Richard barely heard. His mind was already moving slow, precise, dangerous. This wasn't just an attack. It was a declaration. He looked at his reflection, layered over his daughter's image, their faces overlapping, like two halves of one truth. For years he had believed control was strength, but in that moment he understood something else. Sometimes strength begins when control is gone. He whispered, barely audible, "Hold on, sweetheart. I'm here now." Then he turned to Lucas, his voice steady again, colder, sharper. "Get me every name, every detail. Whoever did this, they just started a war." The hallway outside the ICU smelled like antiseptic and rain-soaked clothes. Nurses moved quickly, their shoes squeaking against the polished floor, whispers trailing behind them. Richard Reynolds walked through the corridor like a man half alive, focused but hollowed out by fear. His heart hadn't stopped pounding since the moment he saw Claire through that glass panel. The steady beeping of her heart monitor still echoed in his head, a cruel reminder that life was hanging by a thread. At the reception desk, a nurse straightened nervously when he approached. She knew who he was. Everyone did. The name Reynolds carried weight in Manhattan. But right now, Richard didn't want reverence. He wanted answers. "My daughter," he said quietly. "Claire Reynolds, ICU. What's her condition?" The nurse hesitated, glancing toward the hallway. "She's stable, sir. The baby's heartbeat is strong, but there was abdominal trauma. The doctors are still evaluating the extent of the damage. Stable." The word sounded fragile, temporary, like a paper bridge over a storm. He nodded once, then moved past her toward the glass door of room 7. Inside, Claire looked impossibly small. Her skin was pale, her lips colorless. Tubes and sensors clung to her like ivy, each one blinking or beeping in rhythm with machines that seemed to breathe for her. Richard stood frozen for a long moment, his hand pressed lightly to the glass. He had once told her that control was everything that power was, what kept the world from swallowing you whole. But standing there, watching her chest rise and fall beneath the sterile glow, he realized power couldn't buy a heartbeat. It couldn't rewind a single second of pain. A doctor appeared beside him, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Reynolds," she said softly, "your daughter is sedated to keep her calm. She's responding well, considering the circumstances." "Considering the circumstances?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. "Someone attacked her in a hospital waiting room. I want names. I want footage. I want every detail you have." The doctor exchanged a look with a nearby nurse, then lowered her voice. "The hospital's security team is already reviewing the footage. We've secured a copy for law enforcement." "Good," Richard said. "I'll need a copy as well." A few minutes later, he stood inside a small viewing room behind the nurse's station. The hum of the monitor filled the silence as the head of security pulled up the file. The grainy footage began to play. There she was, Claire sitting alone in the waiting room, scrolling through her phone. Then the doors opened. Vanessa Cole walked in with that same arrogance the tabloids loved to praise. The two exchanged words. The shove came fast. Claire fell. The nurses ran. Chaos erupted. When the video ended, no one spoke. The guard cleared his throat, uneasy. "We found something else at the scene. A bracelet. Silver. Initials VC." He handed it to Richard, sealed in a plastic evidence bag. The engraving gleamed under the fluorescent light. It wasn't just a clue, it was confirmation. Richard stared at the letters for a long time, his jaw tightening. Vanessa Cole, the mistress, the shadow behind his son-in-law's success. The woman Claire had refused to speak about because she wanted to protect the family name. He turned to Lucas, his voice low and deliberate. "Make sure this footage never leaks. Not until I say so. No one uses my daughter's pain as entertainment." Lucas nodded, already typing notes into his tablet. "Understood, sir. What should we do next?" Richard looked back through the window at Claire's still form. His reflection overlapped hers again, his face worn hers, peaceful. In that fragile mirror of glass, he saw both guilt and resolve staring back at him. For now, he said, we protect her. After that, we make sure the world knows exactly who did this. It was no longer just about justice. It was about reclaiming control, not through money, but through truth. And in that moment, the man who had once ruled Wall Street decided to turn every ounce of his power toward one mission, to make sure the silence that almost killed his daughter would never protect anyone again. The rain had eased by the time Ethan Cross arrived at the hospital. But the storm hadn't gone anywhere. It was waiting for him in the corridor, in the eyes of the man standing at the end of it. Richard Reynolds didn't move as his son-in-law approached. He stood perfectly still, hands clasped behind his back. a presence that filled the sterile hallway with a silence more suffocating than any shout could have been. Ethan looked immaculate as always, pressed, suit-polished shoes, the practiced calm of a man who had built a career on appearances. But even the best masks crack when confronted by truth. He slowed his steps as he neared Richard, trying to read his expression and finding nothing but stillness. "Mr. Reynolds?" Ethan began softly. "I came as soon as I heard." "You heard 2 hours ago," Richard said. His voice was quiet but heavy, each word deliberate. Ethan froze, caught off guard by the precision of the statement. "I was in a meeting," he said quickly. "I couldn't just walk out." Richard took a small step forward. "But you could ignore 12 missed calls from the hospital. From me. From your wife." Ethan opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. For the first time in years, he wasn't sitting across from investors or reporters. This wasn't a negotiation. It was judgment. Richard's gaze sharpened. "Do you know what they told me?" he asked, his tone steady, almost conversational. "They said your mistress walked into a hospital and shoved my pregnant daughter to the ground. They said she could have lost her child." "That's impossible," Ethan stammered. "Vanessa would never." Richard cut him off. "Save it." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a tablet. A single tap brought up the hospital footage. He turned the screen toward Ethan without another word. Ethan's eyes flicked to it. The color drained from his face as the video played. The shove, the fall, the chaos. There was no denying it. When the clip ended, the silence between them was unbearable. "She said it was an accident," Ethan whispered, almost pleading. "An accident doesn't come with initials carved into silver," Richard said coldly. He dropped a small evidence bag on the table beside them. Inside, the bracelet glinted under the fluorescent light. "BC. Vanessa Cole." Ethan stared at it, his breath uneven. "She must have panicked," he muttered. "She didn't mean to hurt her." Richard studied him carefully, as if looking for any sign of remorse, and finding only fear. "You brought a viper into our family," he said, his tone low but lethal. "And now she's drawn blood." Ethan's composure shattered. "You have to believe me. I love Claire. I didn't know." Love, Richard interrupted, a faint, humorless smile crossing his face. "Love does not abandon. It does not humiliate. And it doesn't stand by while another woman tries to destroy the mother of your child." The words landed like blows. Ethan's shoulders sagged, his eyes darting toward the closed door of the ICU, as if searching for an escape. But there wasn't one. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "You built your empire on my name, my capital, my trust. You turned loyalty into leverage, and now you'll learn what happens when the foundation you built on deceit starts to collapse." Ethan blinked rapidly, panic creeping into his voice. "Please, Richard, don't do this. If this goes public, it'll destroy everything I've built." Richard's gaze was steady. "Good," he said. "Maybe then you'll understand what it feels like to lose something that truly matters." Lucas appeared at the end of the hall holding a folder. He approached quietly, aware of the tension that filled the space. "Sir," he said to Richard, "the paperwork is ready. The dissolution agreement. It takes effect immediately." Ethan's head snapped up. What paperwork? Richard didn't look away from him. "The end of your partnership with Reynolds Capital. Every contract, every merger, every deal tied to my name, terminated." "You can't," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "You wouldn't." "I already have." He took the folder from Lucas and handed it to him. "Give him the copy," he said. Ethan's hands trembled as he opened it. His eyes scanned the words disbelief flickering across his face, as if he hoped the letters might rearrange themselves into something less final. But they didn't. Richard's voice softened, though it carried no warmth. You thought reputation was power. But real power isn't about being untouchable. It's about what you do when everything you hide finally comes to light. Ethan said nothing. He just stood there, the weight of his own choices pressing down like gravity. Richard turned back toward the ICU window. Beyond the glass, Claire lay still, her heartbeat steady but fragile. He watched her for a moment, then spoke without turning. Go home, Ethan. Or better yet, go to your office and start preparing for what's coming. The press will know soon enough. Ethan didn't move. You're ruining me over one mistake, he said, almost shouting now. One mistake, Richard repeated slowly. Forgetting an anniversary is a mistake. Missing dinner is a mistake. What happened today was an assault. On my daughter. On your child. That's not a mistake, Ethan. That's who you are. The hallway felt smaller, tighter. The air thickened with tension that had nowhere to go. Lucas shifted uneasily beside them. Sir, should I contact legal to finalize everything? Richard nodded once. Do it. Ethan's voice cracked. Please. Think of the baby. Think of Claire. Do you want your grandchild to grow up hearing his father was ruined by his grandfather? Richard's eyes finally met his calm but unyielding. No, he said. I want my grandchild to grow up knowing that actions have consequences and that integrity is worth more than any empire. Ethan's last defense crumbled. He looked smaller somehow, his expensive suit now just fabric draped over guilt. Without another word, he turned and walked down the hallway, his reflection stretching and fading in the glass walls until it disappeared completely. Richard stayed where he was, watching him leave. He didn't feel satisfaction or anger, only a quiet ache that settled deep in his chest. Through the window, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor reminded him why he couldn't stop now. This wasn't revenge. It was responsibility. And for the first time in years, Richard Reynolds knew exactly what kind of man he needed to be. When Richard left the hospital that night, the city looked the same from above. Lights blinked on in office towers, taxis threaded the slick streets, and Manhattan kept breathing as if nothing catastrophic had happened. But beneath that ordinary pulse, a quiet operation was already moving. Richard's world did not do brute force. It moved in silence, in strategy, in leverage. Back at Reynolds Capital, a command center came to life. Analysts who had once chased quarterly targets now hunted for phone records and payment trails. Cybersecurity specialists traced IP addresses. The legal team sifted through contracts, searching for any tie that could be used to expose a cover-up. It was meticulous surgical work, the kind of work that could undo a reputation built on careful omissions. One of his lieutenants reported a link within hours. A modest offshore firm, a PR agency with a payroll trail that led back to Cross Holdings. Transactions labeled as consulting fees, small enough to slip under notice, but frequent enough to show intent. It was the pattern of deliberate concealment. Evidence rarely looks dramatic at first. Most of the time, it is numbers, timestamps, and noise that point to a design. Richard stilled as the report landed on his desk. He had not wanted spectacle. He wanted truth. The decision came with a quiet certainty. If they wanted a war, they would get the truth. He called a tight circle trusted lawyers, a crisis communications lead, Lucas, and the head of security. The plan was not vengeance in the crude sense. It was a defensive campaign built on evidence. Freeze the suspect accounts. Secure backups of every file. Notify the district attorney with a carefully packaged dossier. And control the narrative without feeding the rumor mill. Practical steps mattered. Public exposure without chain of custody can ruin a case. so every move had to be legally airtight. The cybersecurity team documented every access point. The finance group compiled the transfers. The legal counsel prepared subpoenas and criminal referrals. Meanwhile, the communications team drafted messages that would center the victim and the law, not the spectacle. Richard knew the temptation to retaliate in public. He had seen other men unleash lawsuits and social media storms that solved nothing and scarred everything. This would be different. The goal was accountability. If people were going to suffer consequences, they would be based on verified facts, not leaks and gossip. By morning, accounts tied to the PR firm were frozen, and a secure copy of the hospital footage sat on an encrypted server. Investigators from the district attorney's office agreed to receive an immediate briefing. The team mapped witness statements, corroborated timestamps, and flagged potential sources of leaks. Every layer of obfuscation they found strengthened the case. At a strategy meeting, one of the lawyers looked at Richard and said quietly that what they were doing wasn't just legal maneuvering. It was preventive. If the pattern exposed corruption, it could prevent similar harm to other families. Richard felt the truth of that. Power without purpose was empty. Power with purpose could change systems. He also insisted on a humane approach. Claire's recovery came first. No press release would be issued without her consent. The foundation for maternal safety would not be a PR afterthought. It would be a real commitment to hospital protocols and support systems. Practical measures were discussed: better security in waiting rooms, mandatory reporting protocols, funding for trauma counselors, and grants for forensic security upgrades in hospitals. These were the kinds of solutions that mattered more than spectacle. Word began to ripple through certain circles. Small outlets caught wind. Vanessa Cole's camp scrambled, sending denial statements and sympathetic posts. Nathaniel Cross called his lawyers. Some tried to spin accuse, manipulate. It was all predictable. But the work had already started in rooms where truth is made, not performed. Digital forensics kept building the chain. Paper trails showed payments that aligned suspiciously with key dates. Witnesses who had been too afraid to speak found confidence when they saw systems at work. Facts gave them armor. When Lucas updated Richard that the DA wanted an encrypted copy of the evidence, Richard felt that quiet shift he had been waiting for. It was not a triumph of ego. It was the moment when the machinery of justice began to turn toward those who had tried to hide behind money and influence. If they wanted a war, he thought, then so be it. But justice would be the weapon, not revenge. The city might never notice the hours spent poring over ledgers and server logs. But when truth moves that quietly, it moves decisively. By the end of the week, Freeze's subpoenas and referrals had been filed. Reynolds Capital's move was surgical and legal. The public still saw only snatches, whispers, and a family's pain. Behind the scenes, a different story was unfolding, one where power had reached for accountability and found it through patience, rigor, and a refusal to let silence protect brutality. The storm over Manhattan was no longer just noise. It had become a method, and Richard, who had once thought control was currency, had discovered another truth. The most profound power is the will to use facts to protect the vulnerable and stop harm before it repeats. The Reynolds Foundation annual gala had always been a spectacle of elegance: crystal chandeliers, white orchids, champagne towers, and the quiet hum of money disguised as philanthropy. But this year, the room carried a different kind of tension. People whispered more softly. Laughter felt forced. Everyone had heard the rumors about the Reynolds family, but no one dared to say them out loud. At the center of it all stood Richard Reynolds, calm and controlled as ever. He wore the same tailored black suit he had worn to every gala for the past decade, but tonight his presence felt sharper. The smile he offered guests was polite, not warm. Behind the mask of wealth and composure was a storm no one could see coming. Reporters milled about their cameras ready. Investors and socialites clinked glasses, pretending not to notice the empty seat reserved at Richard's table. It was labeled Mrs. Claire Reynolds Cross. Then the room shifted. A murmur spread like a ripple. Heads turned toward the entrance. Claire appeared at the top of the marble staircase, wearing a flowing ivory gown that seemed to glow under the soft golden lights. Her pregnancy was visible, undeniable, and beautiful. The faint scar near her temple told another story, one she didn't need to explain. The room fell silent as she descended the stairs, each step steady, deliberate. People had expected her to hide. Instead, she showed up radiant and unbroken. Her father watched from across the room, pride and sorrow clashing behind his eyes. He didn't approach her. He didn't need to. Just seeing her standing there was enough. For a few moments, the gala carried on. Waiters served hors d'oeuvres. The orchestra played a restrained version of Moon River. But beneath the surface, something was building, an invisible current winding toward revelation. When Richard finally took the stage, the chatter dissolved. He stood behind the podium, his posture tall, his expression grave. Tonight, he began, his voice calm but resonant. We gather to support causes that protect those who cannot always protect themselves. But charity means nothing if we ignore the truth standing right in front of us. A murmur rolled through the crowd. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Many of you know my daughter Claire. You've read stories, some true, most not. Tonight I want you to see what really happened. The lights dimmed. The orchestra fell silent. A giant screen descended from the ceiling. At first there was confusion. Then the video began to play. Grainy footage from the hospital security camera filled the screen. The waiting room. Claire calm and alone. The automatic doors sliding open. Vanessa Cole entering. The confrontation. The shove. The fall. The chaos. Gasps rippled through the audience. Someone whispered Vanessa's name. Phones lifted discreetly, recording what they knew would be tomorrow's headline. In one corner of the room, Vanessa stood frozen. The bright lights and camera flashes found her like heat-seeking missiles. Her face, once the darling of society columns, drained of color. For a second, she looked like a child caught in a lie too big to undo. The video ended. Silence followed, thick, uncomfortable, electric. Then Richard's voice cut through it. "This is what silence protects," he said. "This is what power looks like when it forgets humanity." No one clapped. No one dared. It wasn't a moment for applause. It was reckoning. Vanessa tried to speak, her voice trembling. "That footage is manipulated," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But her words were drowned out by the sharp click of camera shutters and the hum of whispered disbelief. Reporters swarmed. Flashbulbs exploded like lightning. Within seconds, her PR team tried to usher her out, but it was too late. The damage was already global. Screens across the ballroom lit up with notifications as the video began circulating online, leaked by someone who clearly wanted the truth to spread faster than spin could contain it. Richard stepped down from the podium. His expression didn't gloat. It carried the quiet ache of a man who had wanted justice, not spectacle. As he passed his daughter's table, he stopped for a moment. Claire looked up at him. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Across the ballroom, Vanessa's carefully built image, the poised executive, the polished socialite, was unraveling under the relentless glare of truth. Every flash of a camera erased another layer of her pretense. By the time she reached the exit, she wasn't the woman from the tabloids anymore. She was the woman who shoved a pregnant mother to the ground, and the world had just watched her do it. Outside, rain began to fall again, steady and cold, washing the marble steps of the Grand Hotel. Inside, the orchestra resumed playing softer this time, as if to cleanse the air. Richard returned to the stage to close the night. Sometimes he said quietly, the most powerful thing you can give the world isn't charity or influence. It's truth. He raised his glass not for a toast, but as a promise to his daughter, to the unborn child she carried to every person who had ever been silenced by fear or image. And for the first time that night, the room stood in genuine respect, not for power, but for courage. By sunrise, the city was already awake with noise. But this time it wasn't traffic or markets or morning news, it was chaos on every screen. The video from the gala had gone viral overnight. Within hours, hashtags bearing Claire's name and phrases like "Justice for the Reynolds family" were trending across every platform. The footage had been shared, clipped, remixed, and dissected from every possible angle. Millions of people now knew what had happened in that hospital waiting room. News anchors debated morality, talk shows turned it into headlines, and podcasts spun theories about power and privilege. Some called Richard a hero for exposing the truth. Others accused him of orchestrating a public spectacle. But the overwhelming voice of the crowd was clear: Vanessa Cole was guilty in the court of public opinion, long before the legal one could convene. Meanwhile, Vanessa tried to fight back. At dawn, she posted a carefully written statement on her verified account. It was the kind of apology that wasn't really an apology. 3 paragraphs of polished language crafted by a crisis PR firm. She spoke about being misunderstood, about mental strain, about how the footage lacked full context. Within minutes, the internet tore it apart. Comments flooded in angry, mocking, furious. Screenshots of her designer vacation photos resurfaced beside hospital images of Claire. Her words, meant to repair her image, became the spark that burned it to ash. Still, the storm didn't stop there. It grew, mutated, fed by every share and reaction. News outlets uncovered her connections to Ethan's business ventures. Anonymous insiders leaked details about offshore accounts, whispered payments, deleted messages. What had begun as gossip was evolving into evidence. Richard watched the coverage in silence from his office at Reynolds Capital. The screens surrounding him flashed headlines and live updates. But his eyes stayed on one particular clip, a recording from Vanessa's phone that had surfaced overnight. It was short, only 16 seconds long, but devastating. Her voice was unmistakable. "She deserved it," Vanessa said, on the recording, her tone flat and cold. "She's always playing the victim." That was the moment the public tide fully turned. The confession audio had been authenticated by investigators within hours. It wasn't leaked by tabloids or random users. It came directly from the Reynolds legal team, deliberately, methodically. Richard had waited until the evidence was verified before allowing it to be shared. He had promised himself not to act out of rage. Every move had to serve justice, not vengeance. But Claire wasn't sure that line still existed. She sat in her hospital bed, scrolling through headlines that painted her as both a survivor and a symbol. The messages of support were endless flowers, letters thousands of strangers writing about courage and truth. And yet beneath the praise, she felt uneasy. Her father had always known how to control a narrative. Now the same precision that once protected their family was being used like a weapon. When Richard visited that afternoon, he looked tired but composed. The storm outside had barely touched him. Years of boardrooms and negotiations had taught him how to remain calm, even when everything burned around him. "You shouldn't read the comments," he said, gently, noticing her phone. "I'm not," she lied, setting it down. "Dad, did you release that recording?" He hesitated. The world needed to hear it. "But did we?" she asked softly. "You've already given them the footage. They saw what happened. Isn't that enough?" Richard exhaled, the kind of breath that carries the weight of old wounds. Enough for what? For her to hire another lawyer to twist the story again. The only thing people fear more than lies is proof. Claire looked at him, searching his face for the father she had known before the hospital, before the headlines. "I just don't want this to consume us," she whispered. "It's starting to feel less like justice and more like revenge." He didn't answer right away. Outside the window, rain pattered against the glass, the same steady rhythm that had filled the nights after her attack. Finally, he said quietly, "When someone hurts your family, you can't always tell the difference. But I promise you, I know where the line is." She wanted to believe him. But as she watched him leave, surrounded by assistants and security staff, she realized something that scared her more than the attack itself. Once power learns to fight for justice, it rarely stops when justice is done. That evening, Ethan's empire began to collapse in real time. Investors pulled out. Partnerships dissolved. His name became a cautionary tale on financial talk shows, proof that reputation could fall faster than any stock price. For years he had hidden behind charisma and charm. But now every photo of him was paired with headlines about betrayal and complicity. He tried to call Claire once. She didn't answer. The sound of his name alone was enough to make her chest tighten. Back online, the world continued to roar. Some demanded arrests, others praised the Reynolds family as champions of accountability. But a few quieter voices, lawyers, activists, survivors, asked harder questions. Was public humiliation a form of justice or just another kind of violence? Could truth still heal if it was weaponized for spectacle? In those questions, the real conflict began not in courtrooms or boardrooms, but inside the hearts of everyone watching. By nightfall, Manhattan glowed again as if nothing had changed. Yet in apartments and offices, in phones and screens, the conversation raged on. Justice had gone viral. And while Richard stood firm in his belief that truth was worth every consequence, Claire understood something deeper. Once the internet turns pain into performance, no one walks away clean. The morning of the trial began with an unsettling stillness, the kind that comes before a storm. Outside, the New York County Supreme Court reporters filled the marble steps shoulder to shoulder. Satellite trucks lined the street like armor, their antennas aimed at the gray sky. The air was sharp, and the only thing louder than the clicking of cameras was the collective anticipation of a city hungry for justice. Inside the courtroom buzzed with restrained energy. Every seat in the gallery was taken, journalists, legal analysts, spectators, and strangers who had followed the story from the first leaked clip. Everyone wanted to witness what would finally close months of chaos. At the plaintiff's table, Claire sat between her father Richard and their counsel. She wore a simple cream suit that softened her presence but didn't hide her quiet strength. Her hand rested over her belly, a gesture of both protection and defiance. Across the aisle, Vanessa Cole sat rigid, her once flawless composure cracked by weeks of public scrutiny. Her eyes were hollow, her hair tied back tightly as if she could control everything by keeping herself from falling apart. And beside her, Ethan Cross, once her husband, now the city's most despised executive, looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. The arrogance that once filled his posture was gone, replaced by the dull realization that the world he built had already collapsed. When Judge Patterson entered, the murmur died instantly. He was a tall, silver-haired man with a calm that commanded silence. "Court is now in session," he announced. "The People versus Vanessa Cole." The prosecutor, a woman with a clear voice and quiet confidence, began. "Your Honor, members of the jury, this case is not about wealth or reputation. It's about accountability. We will present evidence proving that Ms. Cole intentionally assaulted Mrs. Claire Reynolds Cross, endangering both her and her unborn child. We will also show that her actions were supported financially and strategically by Mr. Ethan Cross." Her tone never wavered, even as the defense lawyer rolled his pen nervously across the table. Then one by one, the screens flickered to life. First came the security footage from the hospital. The video had already been seen by millions online, but inside this quiet room, it carried a different weight. The grainy image showed Claire sitting alone, the sterile light washing her in exhaustion. Then came Vanessa entering, confronting, pushing. The gasp that followed echoed off the courtroom walls. Next, the audio confession played. Vanessa's own voice filled the room colder than anyone expected. She deserved it. She took everything from me. There was no music to soften it, no spin to dilute it. Just her words, heavy and final. Vanessa's head dropped into her hands. A single flash from a reporter's camera broke the silence, quickly reprimanded by the bailiff. The damage was already done. The prosecution continued methodically presenting financial statements that traced transactions between Cross Holdings and Vanessa's PR firm. The numbers told a story of complicity payments disguised as consulting fees made just days before the attack. When Ethan was called to the stand, every camera in the room seemed to lean forward. "Mr. Cross," the prosecutor asked, "did you authorize these payments?" Ethan hesitated, his jaw tightening. For a man used to controlling every narrative, this was the moment the truth refused to be managed. "Yes," he finally said, voice low. "Did you know those funds were used to suppress witnesses and manipulate media coverage after the assault?" He swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. "Yes." The room erupted in murmurs. Even Richard, who had promised himself not to show emotion, clenched his fists beneath the table. Across the room, Vanessa turned toward Ethan with disbelief, realizing he had chosen survival over loyalty. The defense attempted to salvage what it could. "Your Honor," her lawyer argued, "my client acted under emotional distress. This was not premeditated. It was a moment of human weakness, not malice." The prosecutor didn't raise her voice. A moment of weakness doesn't endanger two lives. It doesn't cover up the truth with lies and money. Then came the most unexpected part of the day. The judge called Claire to make a statement. She stood slowly, supported by her attorney. Her voice was soft but unwavering. "I didn't come here for revenge," she said. "I came because no woman should fear for her life in a hospital. No one should believe that money or connections can erase cruelty. This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about the kind of world we allow to exist when we stay silent." For a moment, even the clicking of cameras stopped. The courtroom was completely still. Her words didn't sound rehearsed. They sounded lived. The judge nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds." When he delivered the verdict, hours later, it felt less like an announcement and more like an exhale the entire city had been holding. "We, the jury, find the defendant Vanessa Cole guilty of third-degree assault and intentional infliction of emotional distress." Gasps spread across the room, followed by a quiet hum of relief. Vanessa shook her head as tears streamed down her face. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for this to happen." The judge's tone remained steady. "Ms. Cole is hereby sentenced to 1 year in county jail with mandatory counseling and probation." He turned toward Ethan. "Mr. Cross, while you have cooperated with the investigation, your role in concealing evidence cannot be ignored. You are ordered to pay restitution of $2.5 million to the Reynolds Foundation and perform 6 months of community service." The sound of the gavel striking wood echoed like thunder. In the front row, Richard reached for his daughter's hand. She squeezed back gently, her expression calm, almost serene. For the first time since the attack, the weight on her chest eased. Justice wasn't perfect, but it was enough. As they left the courthouse, the cameras flashed again, but this time Claire didn't flinch. When asked if she forgave them, she paused at the top of the stairs, the winter sun glinting off her hair. "Forgiveness takes time," she said softly. "But peace starts here." That night, the news replayed her words over and over, turning them into something larger than a verdict. Across the city, strangers spoke her name with respect. For once, justice wasn't a headline, it was a heartbeat. And somewhere deep inside that courthouse, as the echoes faded and the lights dimmed, the truth finally and fully stood on its own. A month had passed since the verdict, yet the echo of the gavel still lingered in the city's collective memory. The tabloids had moved on to fresher scandals, but for the Reynolds family, the silence that followed felt like its own kind of noise, gentler but heavy with reflection. The world that once watched them fall apart now watched them rebuild. Claire stood by the window of her father's penthouse overlooking Central Park, cradling her newborn son. The morning light poured in softly, turning the skyline gold. The baby's name was Noah Richard Reynolds, a name that carried both history and hope. His tiny hand wrapped around her finger, and for the first time since that awful morning in the hospital, Claire felt a stillness that wasn't fear. Her father entered quietly, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He looked older now, the sharpness in his eyes tempered by something softer. When he saw his grandson, the corners of his mouth lifted into a rare, genuine smile. "He looks like you," he said, setting the cups down. Claire chuckled. "You think so? I was hoping he'd get your strength." Richard shook his head. "Let's hope he uses his better." They shared a quiet laugh, the kind that comes only after surviving something together. On the coffee table sat a stack of newspapers featuring the headline that had defined the month justice served in Reynolds' case. Below it was another story, smaller, quieter, but more meaningful. Reynolds Foundation for Maternal Safety launches nationwide. The foundation was Richard's way of turning pain into purpose. What began as a promise beside a hospital bed had become a national initiative funding better security in maternity wards, supporting victims of domestic assault and training healthcare staff to recognize warning signs. Hospitals that once felt indifferent were now safer because of a man who once believed money could fix anything and learned that compassion could do more. Claire had agreed to serve as the foundation's ambassador, though she insisted on keeping her role low profile. "This isn't about my story," she told him. "It's about all the women who never get to tell theirs." Richard had simply nodded. "That's exactly why it has to be you." Outside, spring had begun to thaw the city. The air felt lighter, the trees along Fifth Avenue dusted with pale green. In the distance, life went on: buses, taxis, laughter, the faint hum of construction. It was strange. Claire thought how the world doesn't stop, even when yours does. Maybe that was the lesson you rebuild, not because the pain disappears, but because you choose to carry it differently. As she rocked Noah gently in her arms, she asked softly, "Do you ever think about them?" Richard didn't need clarification. "Vanessa and Ethan." He paused. "Sometimes. Not with anger anymore. Just clarity. People like them teach us how fragile truth can be when you trade it for power." Claire nodded, her eyes fixed on the skyline. "I used to think justice was the end of the story, but it isn't." "Is it?" He smiled faintly. "No. Justice is a moment. What comes after, that's character." She turned toward him, the weight of his words settling in. "You changed, Dad." "I had to," he said simply. "Strength isn't revenge. It's what you build after justice." For a long moment they stood there in silence, watching the morning unfold over Manhattan. The light shifted, warming the room, reflecting in Noah's sleepy eyes. Downstairs, the foundation's first press conference was about to begin. Reporters waited outside, expecting grand statements and numbers. What they didn't know was that the real story wasn't the headlines or the donations. It was the quiet transformation of a family learning that peace doesn't come from winning, but from healing. Later that day at the foundation's main hall, Claire stepped onto the small stage, Noah resting peacefully in her arms. Cameras flashed, but she no longer flinched. Her voice was calm, honest. "When I was in that hospital bed," she began, "I thought my life had ended. But pain only wins when we stop fighting. My son is proof that light can still grow from the darkest places. This foundation isn't about revenge. It's about protection, awareness, and dignity for every mother, every daughter, every woman who's ever felt unseen. Applause filled the hall. Not thunderous, but sincere. Richard watched from the back, pride softening his face. For the first time in years, he wasn't the center of the story, and that was exactly how he wanted it. That evening, as the city lights shimmered beyond the glass, Claire placed Noah in his crib. She stood by the window, her reflection merging with the glow of the skyline. She whispered to her son, "You were born from pain, but you'll grow surrounded by love. That's our legacy." Richard joined her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Your mother would have been proud," he said quietly. Claire smiled through tired eyes. Then maybe we finally did something right. Outside Manhattan pulsed with its usual rhythm, no longer a battlefield, but a reminder of survival. Justice had been served, but peace had finally arrived. And in that rare balance between the two, the Reynolds family found something far more enduring than victory. They found grace. By the time spring settled over Manhattan life, inside the Reynolds household had found a rhythm again. The chaos, the headlines, the trial, all of it had begun to fade like a dream that once felt too vivid to be real. Claire spent most mornings in the nursery, sunlight spilling through the tall windows while baby Noah slept in his crib. The city outside moved at its usual relentless pace, but inside those walls, things were finally quiet. At least that's what she thought. One Tuesday afternoon, a knock echoed through the penthouse. It wasn't the housekeeper or a courier she recognized. Her father's assistant, Lucas, stood at the door instead, holding a large manila envelope with no return address. His face carried that cautious look she had come to associate with bad news. "This was delivered to my office," he said. "No sender, no tracking number. I thought you should see it first." Claire hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single photograph printed on glossy paper, slightly bent at the corners. It showed Vanessa Cole in a prison jumpsuit sitting on a narrow metal bench. Her expression wasn't anger or regret. It was something else, almost unsettling. A faint, knowing smile. Scrawled on the back of the photo in neat black ink were 6 words that made Claire's breath catch. "You were right. There's still one secret left." Her pulse quickened. For a moment she just stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. Vanessa had been sentenced. Her appeals had failed. She was supposed to be gone from their lives. So what secret could possibly be left? She handed the photo to Lucas, who frowned. "Could be someone trying to stir things up again," he said carefully. "We can trace the paper, see where it was printed." But Claire shook her head. "No. Whoever sent this wanted me to read it, not investigate it." Later that night, she sat in the nursery, the photo still on the table beside her. Noah stirred in his sleep, his small hand twitching as if chasing dreams. She reached out and brushed a lock of hair from his forehead, whispering, "You'll never know that kind of darkness, not if I can help it." Then her phone buzzed. No caller ID, just a message. The one who made sure you survived. Her fingers froze over the screen. She stared at the text for a long moment, rereading it again and again. There was no name, no number, just that one chilling line. It wasn't a threat. It felt like a reminder. Or maybe a warning. She typed a reply, hesitated, then sent it anyway. "Who are you?" The response came almost instantly. "Someone who still believes in justice." The air in the room seemed to thicken. She looked around as if expecting someone to be standing there. Nothing. Just the soft hum of the baby monitor and the quiet rhythm of Noah's breathing. She thought about everything that had happened. The shove in the hospital, her father's war against deceit, the trial that had turned their lives inside out. Could someone else have been watching all along, helping unseen? A memory flashed through her mind, a shadow in the hallway the night of the gala, a voice that had whispered her name before security arrived. At the time, she thought it was panic playing tricks on her. But what if it wasn't? She scrolled through her phone, checking the message again. No trace, no metadata. Whoever sent it knew how to stay hidden. When her father came in a few minutes later, she quickly turned the phone face down. He was carrying a small stuffed bear, a gift for Noah. He looked more relaxed these days, though the years of battle had left faint lines on his face. "Everything okay?" he asked, noticing her distracted expression. Claire smiled faintly. "Yeah, just tired." He placed the bear in the crib beside Noah. "Get some rest," he said softly. "You've earned peace." When he left, she turned the phone over again. The message was still there, glowing faintly in the dark. Peace. She wanted to believe it was real. But deep down, she knew better. Outside rain began to tap gently against the windows, just as it had on the day everything began. She looked out over the city lights, the same skyline that had watched her family's rise their fall, and now this uneasy calm. Somewhere out there, someone still held a piece of the story she didn't know. Claire picked up the photo one last time, studying Vanessa's smirk. There was no fear in it, just certainty. She whispered to herself, "Then it's not over." In the distance, thunder rolled faintly over the city. The storm that had once destroyed her life had returned, but this time she wasn't afraid of it. She was ready. And as the screen of her phone dimmed to black, the final message blinked once more before disappearing entirely. Justice never ends. It just changes hands. The night outside deepened, but somewhere beyond the skyline, a new story was already beginning.